The authors acknowledge that this podcast was recorded on the traditional, unceded lands of the Lekwungen peoples.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Hello, and welcome back to Stories from Space. I'm your host, Matt Williams. And today we're picking up where we left off last time with the space race. Last time we looked at the inception of the space race, how it was very much related to the Cold War, which in turn was also related to World War II and its immediate aftermath, where the US and Soviets both began recruiting German rocket scientists to leverage the advances they'd made during the war, which was best demonstrated in the V-2 rocket. And as noted, the Soviets gained an early lead in the space race, having launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, to space in 1957, and how this led to the creation of NASA and efforts to not only deploy satellites, but the first human beings into orbit. And once again, the Soviets had an early lead on that, with the flight of Yuri Gagarin and Valentina Tereshkova, the first man and woman, respectively, to go to space, and how NASA sought to catch up with the launch of the Mercury 7 astronauts as part of the Mercury program. Having demonstrated their ability to build launch vehicles and spacecraft that could put human beings in orbit, both sides then turned to the development of technologies that would allow for longer duration missions in space, as well as extravehicular activity, EVA, also known as spacewalks, and spacecraft rendezvous, all of which would be in preparation for eventual crewed missions to the moon. And for NASA, this was all about paving the way for the Apollo program, whereas the Soviets, through their Voskhod program, they managed to accomplish some feats, but otherwise made little progress. So at this point in the game, NASA was ahead. Not only had they carried out EVAs and spacecraft rendezvous, they had managed to keep a crew of 2 Gemini astronauts in space for 2 weeks. This was the Gemini 7 mission, piloted by Frank Borman and Jim Lovell. And this was especially important because it demonstrated that astronauts could function in space almost twice as long as the 8-day period that astronauts would need in order to reach the moon, conduct surface operations, and return home. So with the Gemini program complete by 1966, NASA could devote all of its attention and resources on sending crewed missions to the lunar surface before the Soviets, which is something that had begun roughly 5 years earlier. Now, interestingly enough, before Gagarin's flight in 1961, President John F. Kennedy was actually lukewarm on the idea of committing to a moon landing. As early as March of 1961, about 2 months before President Kennedy stood before Congress and announced the inauguration of the Apollo program, then NASA Administrator James Webb submitted a budget requisition that assessed the costs of achieving a moon landing before 1970. At the time, Kennedy rejected it as too expensive. By April, that changed considerably. It was on April 12th that Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space. And as noted in our previous installment, this inspired NASA and the U.S. government to accelerate their efforts to send astronauts to orbit and beyond. And as of April 20th, 1961, Kennedy asked his VP, Lyndon Johnson, to look into the American space program and explore options. 2 major options emerged. One was for an Earth orbital space station, while the other was a crewed landing on the moon. Either of these would put the U.S. in a leading position against the Soviets, and in addition, Johnson consulted with Wernher von Braun, who was director of the Marshall Space Flight Center at the time and the architect behind several of NASA's rockets. And this included the Saturn family of rockets that would eventually give way to the Saturn V, which would take the Apollo missions to the moon. Braun provided estimates of the U.S. and Soviet rocket lifting capability and recommended that the moon landing option was the far better choice, and that the U.S. had a good chance of getting there first. On May 25, 1961, John F. Kennedy inaugurated the program when he stood before Congress to deliver a speech titled Special Message on Urgent National Needs. During the speech, he said, "This nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before the decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth." He also indicated that this program was necessary for national security and that it would focus the nation's energies on other scientific and social fields. He further rallied support with his We Choose to Go to the Moon speech, which was delivered at Rice University in Houston on September 12, 1962. A clip of this speech, featured at the beginning of this episode, also outlined the needs for this program as a means of focusing the nation's energies and achieving something that many thought was unachievable. Over the next 3 years, NASA's budget was increased almost fivefold, and its workforce expanded to include 34,000 NASA employees, plus 375 employees from commercial and university contractors. In 1963, after President Kennedy was murdered, Johnson took the helm and immediately issued Executive Order 11129, which officially renamed the Cape Canaveral and Apollo launch facilities in Florida the Kennedy Launch Center. On the Soviet side, Kennedy's pronouncements were met with silence from Khrushchev, who refused to publicly confirm or deny that the Soviets were pursuing a moon race. However, the Soviets did pursue 2 competing plans for crewed lunar missions, which they would continue to do in secret throughout the 1960s. Meanwhile, NASA planners continued to work towards the moon landing, and this included the development of the Saturn V, as mentioned, but also the Apollo spacecraft, a 3-module spacecraft that would be capable of carrying a crew of 3. These modules consisted of the Command, Service, and Lunar module, whereas all 3 modules would fly together as part of the Apollo spacecraft to the moon. The Command and Service module would remain in orbit of the moon with a single pilot, while the Lunar module took 2 astronauts to the surface. This module also consisted of 2 parts, the lander element and the ascent element. After conducting operations on the lunar surface for several days, the 2 astronauts would then board the ascent vehicle, launch back into orbit, where they would rendezvous with the Command and Service module, transfer back, and return to Earth. While this was taking place, the Soviets considered 2 possible mission profiles for sending crews to the moon. The first was developed between March 1962 and May 1963, where Sergei Korolev, the Soviets' lead rocket engineer and spacecraft designer, began developing concepts for a lunar spacecraft that would eventually inform the design of the Soyuz. Opposite him, a separate design bureau, OKB-52, led by Vladimir Chalomy, was developing the LK-1 lunar flyby spacecraft. This would be launched by the Proton UR-500 rocket, which was currently under development. On August 3, 1964, the Soviet Communist Party's Central Committee issued Command 655-268, titled On Work on the Exploration of the Moon and Mastery of Space. This plan called for circumlunar flights to take place in 1967, and with landing starting in 1968 to get there ahead of the Apollo flights. It was here that both Korolev and Chalomy submitted their proposals. Korolev, named N1L3, called for the use of a N1 super rocket and a more advanced Soyuz 7K-L3 spacecraft. The spacecraft was also known as the Lunar Orbital Module, or LOK, that would carry a crew of 2 to lunar orbit, whereas a separate lunar lander, known as the LK, would carry 1 cosmonaut to the surface. The N-1 rocket was the most ambitious Soviet launch vehicle ever attempted. It consisted of 3 stages that would launch the vehicle and its payload to Earth orbit. Meanwhile, a 4th stage would help the spacecraft leave Earth orbit, while a 5th stage would assist with a lunar landing. While the rocket was roughly the same height and takeoff mass as the 3-stage Saturn V, it exceeded the Saturn V's takeoff thrust by 28%, 45,400 kilonewtons versus the Saturn V's 33,000. However, the N1 had only about half the payload capability for translunar injection maneuvers as the Saturn V, which could deliver 52,759 kilograms, or 116,314 pounds, to the moon, whereas the N1 could deliver only 23,500 kilograms, or 52,000 pounds. Much of this was due to the fact that the Saturn V relied on liquid hydrogen fuel in its two upper stages, whereas the Soviet space program did not incorporate liquid hydrogen at all until the 1970s, after the N1 was cancelled. Meanwhile, Chalomny's program called for a direct ascent lander based on the LK, known as the LK-700, that would carry a crew of 3 cosmonauts on a direct flight to the lunar surface and back. The spacecraft would be launched with the proposed UR-700 heavy lift vehicle, which was never realized. Ultimately, the Soviet government rejected Korolev's proposals and decided to go with Chalomny's project. However, by 1964, Khrushchev's fall from power led to Chalomny losing most of his support and funding. And by August 1965, work on the LK-1 was suspended and eventually cancelled, and a new proposal emerged where a stripped-down Soyuz spacecraft, known as Zond, would carry a 2-person crew on a circulunar flight without landing. Unfortunately, in 1967, both NASA and the Soviet space program suffered a terrible tragedy which set back their programs. For NASA, this took place on January 27, 1967, in what has come to be known as the Apollo 1 accident. During a dress rehearsal test at Cape Kennedy Air Force Station Launch Complex 34, Commander Pilot Gus Grissom, Senior Pilot Ed White, and Pilot Robert B. Chaffee were killed when the Apollo 1 command module suddenly caught fire. These astronauts were all veterans who cut their teeth in the Mercury and Gemini programs. The name Apollo 1, which had been chosen by the crew, was made official by NASA in honor of their deaths. For the Soviets, tragedy struck on April 24, 1967, when the Soyuz 1 spacecraft, piloted by Vladimir Kamarov, suffered in-flight failures, leading to the first in-flight spaceflight fatality. This planned 3D test would consist of the first Soviet docking maneuver with an unpiloted Soyuz 2 spacecraft. As soon as the mission launched to space, many problems began to emerge. This included one of the 2 solar panels on the spacecraft, which failed to deploy, leaving it with insufficient electrical power. Then, the automatic attitude control system failed, which caused the craft to fall into a spiral. Kamarov managed to regain control manually, and flight controllers aborted the mission. Kamarov was ordered to make an emergency re-entry. However, there was a fault in the landing parachute system. While the reserve chute deployed, it became tangled with the drogue chute, and the Soyuz 1 spacecraft impacted on the ground and exploded. In addition to the loss of Vladimir Kamarov's life, this accident imposed an 18-month delay before the Soviets could resume piloted Soviet flights. Both Apollo and the Soyuz program managed to recover, however, as engineers addressed the faults in both the Apollo command module and Soyuz spacecraft. NASA then proceeded with unpiloted test launches of the Saturn V, consisting of Apollo 4 and 6, which launched on November 9, 1967 and April 4, 1968, respectively. In between, the Apollo 5 mission saw the first flight of an uncrewed Apollo lunar module on January 22, 1968. These missions validated both the launch vehicle and the lunar module's capability of carrying 3 astronauts into lunar orbit. Next came the Apollo 7 mission on October 11, 1968, which sent a lunar module on an 11-day mission around the moon. The mission was a total success and allowed NASA to move ahead with its planned lunar mission schedule, which led to the Apollo mission launching on December 21, 1968. The mission saw Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders conduct the first flight of a Saturn V and Apollo spacecraft with crew, and they became the first mission to leave low Earth orbit and travel to another celestial body. During the same time, the Soviet lunar program managed to make some progress. However, their efforts were hampered by the death of Korolev in January 1966. While the Soviets managed to fix the parachute and control systems with their Soyuz spacecraft, the next piloted mission of the Soyuz 3, which launched on October 26, 1968, failed to complete Kamarov's goal of rendezvousing and docking with an unpiloted Soyuz 2. This docking maneuver was not realized until January 1969, which was achieved by the Soyuz 4 and 5 missions. This constituted the first ever docking of 2 spacecraft and the first transfer of crew from one spacecraft to the other. However, The Soviet Zond spacecraft was not ready in time for piloted circumlunar flights, which were hoped to take place in 1968. 6 automated test launches were conducted, but all were unsuccessful. By March of 1968, the Zond 4 mission successfully launched and conducted an uncrewed circumlunar flight. Unfortunately, problems with the spacecraft during re-entry led ground controllers to detonate it while it was 15 kilometers or 9.3 miles above the surface over the Gulf of Guinea. The N-1 rocket also suffered catastrophic failures that led to its cancellation. Both took place in 1969, the worst of which took place on July 3rd, when the N-1 rocket exploded on the launch pad, destroying itself and the facility. This was a setback from which the Soviet lunar program would not recover. The mission planners began to set their sights on other long-term goals instead. NASA continued to push ahead, and by March of 1969, the Apollo 9 mission conducted the first successful flight test of the lunar module in low Earth orbit. Apollo 10, the dress rehearsal for the moon landing, was then flown from May 18th to the 26th. Once the spacecraft reached lunar orbit, astronaut John Young remained in the command and service module, while astronauts Thomas Stafford and Gene Cernan flew the Apollo lunar module to within 14.4 kilometers, or about 8.95 miles from the lunar surface. It was at this point where the lunar module would begin its powered descent to the lunar surface. With this mission complete and the lunar module validated for landing crews on the surface, the next step was to attempt the landing. This began on July 16, 1969, as the Apollo 11 mission launched. Once in orbit, astronaut and pilot Michael Collins remained in the command and service module, while astronauts Neil Armstrong and Edward Buzz Aldrin boarded the lunar module for the descent. Armstrong and Aldrin landed successfully on July 20th, becoming the first astronauts to land on the moon, and Armstrong becoming the first man to walk on the moon. The event, which was live broadcast and watched by millions of people around the world, witnessed Armstrong issuing the following historic words.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The lander element of the lunar module, which was left behind, also featured a commemorative plaque with the inscription, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." Upon their return to Earth, the astronauts conducted a global tour, in which they were welcomed and celebrated in every country they visited, including the Soviet Union. This is similar to the reception Yuri Gagarin received when he conducted a similar tour after becoming the first man to go to space. This once again demonstrated that, through their respective space programs, the United States and Soviet Union could find common ground. Even though they were locked in a state of competition, their achievements were celebrated on both sides, and went on to inspire generation after generation to come. It was also in keeping with the spirit of the Outer Space Treaty, otherwise known as the Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies. The treaty established that the exploration and use of outer space shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interests of all countries, and shall be the province of all mankind. The treaty also forbid weapons testing in orbit and stationing any military assets or facilities on the Moon and beyond. This treaty was signed on January 27, 1967, and remains in force to this day. This was echoed by the lunar plaques that adorned all the Apollo lunar modules, and the words "for all mankind" have become synonymous with space exploration and have enduring meaning to this day. The Apollo program would continue, and 5 more successful landings would be carried out between late 1969 and 1972. This consisted of the Apollo 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17 missions, the one exception being Apollo 13, which, in April 1970, suffered a failure with its oxygen tank in the service module 2 days after it launched. This disabled the electrical and life support systems, and the crew was forced to make a circumlunar flight and then return home. Fortunately, the crew, consisting of James L. Lovell, John L. Swigert, and Fred W. Hayes, managed to make it home safe and sound. Like the Apollo 11 mission, all those that made it to the lunar surface conducted scientific experiments and retrieved samples of lunar rock, which they returned to Earth for analysis. Ongoing research of these rock samples have revolutionized our understanding of the Earth-Moon system and led to the widely held view that the Earth and Moon formed together after a massive impact struck Earth roughly 4.5 billion years ago. In addition, samples of lunar rock also revealed traces of water. At the time, this was dismissed as evidence of contamination. However, these findings would be validated by multiple missions shortly after the turn of the century. The realization that there are deposits of lunar water on the Moon is also intrinsic to future plans to explore around the Moon's South Pole Aitken Basin and construct permanent habitats there. By landing on the Moon, the United States had effectively won the space race and demonstrated their technological advantage over the Soviets. However, this achievement would also signal a new spirit of cooperation, the seeds of which were planted in the post-Apollo era and would eventually lead to the creation of the International Space Station. A good example was achieved in 1975 with the joint Apollo-Soyuz program, which saw 3 U.S. astronauts aboard an Apollo spacecraft dock in orbit with a Soviet-made Soyuz vehicle. The commanders of the two craft then rendezvoused and performed the iconic handshake in space. This came to symbolize the gradual improvement of U.S. and Soviet relations in the Cold War era. And with the space race now complete, both NASA and the Soviets began to shift their focus onto technologies and systems that would allow for even longer durations in space, particularly in orbit. Whereas the space race had all been about getting there first, the focus now was staying there. To this end, both NASA and the Soviets began developing technologies that would eventually lead to the Space Shuttle program and the Buran Shuttle, as well as the Salyut, Skylab, Mir, and International Space Stations. In addition, the achievements made during the space race, particularly with the Apollo program, would go on to inspire NASA to begin planning its next great leap, which began shortly after the turn of the century. These include the long-awaited plans to return to the Moon, to stay this time, and to send the first crewed missions to Mars. 2 subjects that were covered very early in the series, and I invite listeners to go check those out if you haven't already. And if you have, consider checking them out again as a refresher. In the meantime, thank you for listening. I'm Matt Williams, and this has been Stories from Space.